Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ellen Richstone, Board Director of the NACD New England chapter. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program, a fireside chat with Brookings Institution economist Ben Harris. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder to remain muted throughout the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion of the event to submit questions. We will monitor the chat box during the panel discussion and intersperse the questions either during or at the end. Next, we know that many of you want to receive credits for this program. To receive credits, we need to know your first and last name. Please make sure that your full name is visible on your Zoom window. Finally, the panelists and moderators' statements and opinions are their own and not the companies with which they work. We go to the sponsor slide. All right. I would be remiss if I did not thank our chapter sponsors. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It is their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric, local programming, and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that is vital to advancing excellence in the boardroom. Today, we are highlighting Lockton and Mirus Capital Advisors, who have continued to support our mission of excellence in corporate governance. Thank you very much for your support. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Kathy Minahan. Kathy is the NACD New England Board President and the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. I will now turn it over to Kathy.
Thanks so much, Ellen. I'm excited to be here today and to introduce today's speaker. We're going to have what we're calling a fireside chat, which is a little less formal, but I think should end up being a good way to interact with you and then provide some time for questions at the end. I'm so pleased to have Ben Harris here today. He's the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies Program at the Brookings Institution. He was the Executive Director of the Kellogg Public-Private Initiative and a Research Associate Professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He's a longtime economic advisor to Joe Biden and was also a senior economist with the Council of Economic Advisors and the House Budget Committee. And on top of all that, he's a great guy and a good friend and someone I look forward to when I go to Brookings meetings because he's always got his mind on what's going on. So Ben, thanks so much for being here today. Start off with a simple question. Where do you see the economy today? What are we going to be looking at 2025? What are the major risks and what are the major strengths of our economy as we see it now?
So let me just say thank you so much for hosting me here today. It's such an honor, Kathy, to be here with you. And I really enjoyed seeing all the welcomes coming across the screen. I always learn a lot when I get outside of Washington, D.C. So I look forward to the conversation later on. So as far as a general overview of the U.S. economy right now, in just a word, I mean, we're in great shape. The U.S. economy ran hot, I think, as people know, for the first part of the Biden administration. We saw inflation that we hadn't seen in decades since the 1970s, and that was a major problem. But in general, I think the economy right now is incredibly strong from a few different dimensions. So let me go through those. When it comes to economic growth, we've been growing around 3% a year for the past 2 years. That's certainly an enviable position from a developed economy perspective. The US is the envy of the developed world from an economic perspective. And a lot of that growth has been coming from consumption. From the US economy, we sort of begin and end with the consumer. So of that 3% growth over the past 2 years, about 2% of that has come from consumption. And even digging down further, that consumption has been really well diversified. So it's been split between growth in consumption in goods and growth in consumption of services. And even if you look within goods, you've seen a lot of diversification. So it's an increase in spending on durable goods. It's an increase in spending on non-durable goods like food and going out to eat. So the U.S. economy, the U.S. consumer has just been on fire for the past couple years. And you could say, well, are we running out of steam? I don't think we're running out of steam, but we are certainly slowing down. So you can look at data from the New York Fed around transitions into delinquencies, for example, and you'll see that there is some cause for concern, particularly when you talk about credit card debt and auto debt. So on a quarter by quarter basis, we can look at transitions into serious delinquency. On credit card debt, it's gone from around 6.4% of households to about 7.2%. That's right in line with historical averages, maybe a little bit high. We're seeing similar patterns with auto loan debt, but mortgage debt is really low. It's around 1%, which is low. And then student loan debt is also low, but that's due, I think, to policy decisions by the Biden administration. So we're growing at a healthy clip. U.S. consumption is pretty strong. The labor market is normalizing, which is, I think, positive. We saw just wacky numbers in terms of labor market tightness. You saw the U3, the headline unemployment rate, go down to 3.4%. Now it's around 4%. But even if you look at numbers as far as the turnovers, you saw people were just quitting at unprecedented rates. And quits are a sign that workers are really confident they can find another job. We were seeing quits rates along the lines of things I thought we would never see. And you also saw job postings go to levels around 12 million job postings. You probably want to be around 7 to 8 million job postings. That's where we are. So we've seen this rebalancing in the labor market, which has been, it's good news. You don't want so few workers that we can't fill those slots. So from a labor market perspective, things appear to be rebalanced. The big risk out there right now is twofold. One is inflation. And so, as everyone knows, as we talk,
and that's what everybody was talking about during.
That's what everyone was talking about,
Yeah.
and we can kind of get into consumer sentiment and maybe in a second, but just characterizing inflation. And I think this is underappreciated a bit. The U.S. over the last 4 or 5 years had actually 2 inflation episodes. So one, you saw inflation go really high. The CPI, which is the best measure of household inflation, went to around 9%.
Right.
And it was like everything inflation. For about the first 18 months or so after the pandemic, it was everything inflation. You saw.
Wasn't that because we threw money at the pandemic?
Well, I think that
anyway.
So I think there's 3 reasons why you saw inflation. I mean, inflation happens when we're spending above our capacity as a country. And so one, you saw our ability to kind of produce was sharply curtailed. People were staying home, supply chains were snarled. And I think there's pretty good evidence that the bulk of the inflation, of the excess inflation, so we're usually seeing inflation around 2%. So excess inflation, so that extra 7 percentage points of inflation, most of that, in my view, was driven by factors related to the pandemic. A lot of it around the labor market, the fact that everyone was staying in. Some of it was driven by the unprecedented government support. Now, for some reason, when people talk about the government support, they tend to put all of their focus on the 1.9 trillion in the ARP. But there was also the CARES Act, which was even larger than the ARP, and then 2 subsequent bills. These were all bipartisan bills except for the ARP. So, I came out of the Biden administration. I was Assistant Treasury Secretary. I get a little defensive when all of the blame is put directly on the ARP. It was a series of bills, right? It was 4 bills. It was unprecedented. And the reason why both Republicans and Democrats had to go so big, why they had to throw, I don't know, $6 trillion, was because we have really poor systems put in place around automatic stabilizers. We have unemployment systems which are using software that is 40, 50 years old. If we had better software in place, we could have better targeted that unemployment, extra unemployment support. But instead, because we're using software that's older than me, we had to go ahead and give everyone $600 extra. So part of that was a design flaw. But I think that you're right. I mean, that has to be part of the conversation. But I think also a big driver of inflation was this wealth boom that we had in the United States. So we went into the pandemic around the middle part of 2020 with household wealth was around $100 trillion. We came out of it in 2024 with household wealth being around $150 trillion. And so household wealth basically just grows at a really steady rate. But starting around 2020, it just went up like this. We became much richer. We became much richer because equity markets were on fire. We became much richer because the value of our homes went up by so much. This is a good thing. I mean, Americans being wealthier is a great thing, but I think that just gave people confidence that, look, you can spend down your checking account and not necessarily worry about it. And so inflation had these two different episodes. The first one was an everything inflation for about a year and a half, and then it was largely driven by shelter inflation. So from the middle part of 2022 until 2024, until today, if you took shelter out of inflation, if you look at everything else inflation, we were growing at well under 2% for prices, which is beneath the Fed's target.
Yeah.
So housing inflation is a different type of inflation. It's driven by
So, I mean, this is so clear to you and so clear when you're talking about it, but how come it was so not clear over the last couple of years? And there seems to be so much residual consumer angst over inflation.
Well, I think part of it is misinformation. So we had, and I think, people used to go ahead and read the Wall Street Journal, which I think is a terrific publication, New York Times, listen to NPR, and we're kind of all dealing with the same set of facts. But now you have social media, and a lot of people are going to social media for getting their information, and they're getting their information. Some of it is deliberate misinformation by Russia and other actors that are trying to get Americans to think differently. But there was a paper by our flagship publication, the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, by this Harvard economist named Stephanie Stancheva. And Stephanie went ahead and polled people in, I believe it was 2023. But at the time, year-over-year inflation was 3.1%. And the average response for people reporting inflation was well over 7%. And a quarter of people thought it was more than 10%. Now, it is possible that people just experience inflation differently. And even though the question was asked, what is national inflation? Look, if inflation is 10%, I'm just really furious as a consumer. But what do you do when inflation is 3%, but people think it's 10%? Right? That's a perception problem.
Yeah.
And so that had real implications, not just for the election, but also for consumer sentiment.
Yeah.
Which was as the economy was on fire, as we had a sub 4% unemployment rate, as equity markets were rising by the day, people had a sentiment that looked like it was 2008 when we were in a global financial crisis and people were getting laid off left and right. It has to be misinformation. One of my favorite data points around misinformation is a Morning Consult poll in 2022, when we were 2 years from the COVID recession. It would be at least another 2 years before we had another recession. The share of respondents who said we were in a recession was around 2/3. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? So I think the misinformation is part of it. But the U.S. economy, I'm still trying to go back to your original question, Kathy, which is I think the U.S. economy is in great shape right now. There are a couple big sources of risk, and one is around inflation. Is around if people start expecting more inflation, we get in this spiral, which as you know, given your leadership role with the Fed, and that's just catastrophic. I mean, that just goes back to some of the problems we dealt with in the 1970s, when you can get stagflation, where people start buying in advance in anticipation of future price increases when they kind of get used to inflation. And so inflation remained really well anchored in the last episode, and I attribute some of that to the credibility of the Federal Reserve. But now, as people have inflation on their minds and really salient prices, like buying eggs now feels like you need a loan.
Yeah, but there's a reason for that. I mean, the bird
The avian flu, yes.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the most salient price is retail gas.
Yeah.
And that's why you had Ron Klain, who is Biden's chief of staff, tweeting out about retail gas prices every single day, because look, if I was president, I would do everything I could to drive down the price of gas, because it's not just about gas. It's also about people's perceptions around inflation, which largely forms their consumer sentiment. So if you want people to be happy, have low gas. But so the first risk is that people have sort of internalize higher prices. And then you start getting people buying products in advance, And people starting to ask, workers start to ask for more raises because they're anticipating inflation. And then you get this really problematic spiral. And the Fed, Kathy, as you know better than anyone, has to go ahead and jack up interest rates. And then you get inflation plus slow growth. And that's a recipe for stagflation. So it's really important that we have a credible Fed and people are not expecting more inflation. So inflation is a risk. The tariff policy, I know we'll get to this later, the tariff policy has led people to start anticipating price increases. And so if you look at the last inflation report, you saw a big jump in auto prices without necessarily a reason why there should be auto prices increased. And so if you kind of dig deeper on that, you saw that dealers were raising the prices largely through offering fewer incentives. But that was because people were anticipating tariffs on autos and are starting to want to buy in advance of those tariffs. And so that's how you get this sort of this price spiral that's so problematic. The other more general risk is just around policy uncertainty. And there's this.
Let's talk a little bit about that because that
Yeah.
kind of plays into the day-to-day. It seems like years since the Trump administration began, but it's only been a month, and every day brings a little bit more one thing or another thing that's, you know, kind of being dropped in our laps. How do you see that affecting what you've said is really a pretty favorable economic outlook?
So, I mean, you just told everyone that I used to work for Biden. And so I think my probably general outlook on Trump is well known, but I want to be fair. And if you're looking at the banks, there is this kind of general positive animal spirit feeling right now. So Republican consumers are really optimistic. Republican business owners are really optimistic. This usually happens when you see a change between administrations. You saw the same thing happen with Democrats at the beginning of the Biden administration. It always happens, but here the optimism is really high. I think that a lot of business leaders were frustrated with the regulatory agenda of the Biden administration and are excited to see a more business-friendly business agenda. A lot of people are optimistic about the tax cuts, which are coming without a doubt. And so you have a lot of optimism that is generally characterized as animal spirit. So you are seeing, we talked about increases in growth at the beginning, you know, it's not just consumers, it's also continued investment, which is usually depressed at this point in the business cycle. So there are, you know, there is a lot of enthusiasm. And the way that I look at it was that the Trump administration was handled this just terrific economy. And if it generally behaves the way it did with the first administration, which was minimally to moderately disruptive in terms of trade policy and regulation and geopolitics, then you can expect this to continue. And I have full faith that the Fed will handle inflation if it's not driven too much by additional tariffs. So things are good until they're not.
Yeah.
But if we get an across the board tariff, you know, all bets are off.
You had an op-ed last Friday, in the New York Times, and you brought up this increase in potential increase in public debt. And this op-ed talks a bit about a fiscal crisis. Your colleague from Brookings, Wendy Eidelberg, I should mention her name because it was a joint article.
Yeah.
Love to get some insights, the insights that you have put into that article about the risk of increasing public debt, because you've been talking a bit about that.
Yeah, and so the New York Times actually delayed publication until this morning. So
Okay. I thought it was last Friday.
Yeah, and the general gist of the op-ed. So I worry a lot about the public debt. The public debt now is around 100% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
If we've been speaking, you know, 20 years ago, before the great financial crisis, it would have been around 40 or 50% of GDP. And you could have said to me, Ben, what would happen if we reach 100% of debt to GDP? And I would say, Kathy, it would never happen. Like the markets would have freaked out, you know, we would have had a crisis. And here we are at 100% debt to GDP. So no one knows what will happen. But what Wendy and I cautioned was that it's not necessarily the ever rising increase in debt to GDP that could cause a fiscal and financial crisis. That has economic costs, largely in the form of higher interest rates and crowding out private investment. And it basically means, you know, people will invest in treasuries and they won't invest in other types of private sector investment that will make us so much more prosperous. But that's like a slow burn. That's a slow moving cost, and will largely be borne by our children and grandchildren. But in terms of a fiscal and financial crisis, we say that would be caused by political malpractice. That can be caused by a statement saying, for example, that we won't make payments on Treasury debt. That will happen if we lose credibility in the Fed and investors see runaway inflation. And that will happen, honestly, if we sort of govern the way that Doge has been governing, which is sidestepping the rule of law. I mean, all investors want to know is that they're going to get paid with 100% and certainty, with 100% certainty on Treasuries.
Right.
And if we go from Treasuries being a risk-free asset, I mean, there is risk with Treasuries, but not default risk, right? Everyone thinks they're going to get paid when you invest in a Treasury. Now, maybe you'll have misanticipated inflation. There may be other risks, but when it comes to default risk, that's zero. And if we go from Treasuries being a risk-free asset to being a risky asset, then you could see the interest rate on Treasuries go up by 3 or 4 percentage points,
Yep.
which would cause a fiscal and financial crisis. I mean, I will say I was Assistant Treasury Secretary in March of 2023 when we had the Silicon Valley Bank crisis and Signature Bank crisis. And I've never been so scared for the US economy and we were right on the razor's edge. And a lot of that was, I mean, some of that was driven by improper supervision and really bad decisions by managers of those banks. But what sparked it all was higher interest rates.
Yep.
And so our point is
unexpected higher interest rates.
Unexpected higher interest rates. The point is that beware of political malpractice and beware of statements that have been made, honestly, like our current president, who has said, look, I'm considering not making payments to Chinese debt holders. And, if a Chinese debt holder isn't going to get paid, then who's to say that a South Korean debt holder will also not get paid? Or, whoever else, maybe I don't know, investors living in San Francisco. I don't know. But if we introduce risk into treasuries, there's a real concern.
Yes. You mentioned tariffs. Everybody's talking about tariffs. What do you think really is going to happen? We know it could be very bad, it particularly could be very bad, particular industries. But do you think that's really going to happen? What's your sense? How would you bet if you were a betting person?
So
and maybe you are, I don't know.
No, I love a good poker game, but on tariffs, okay. So we went into the last Trump administration. The average tariff rate on imports was around 1.5% and had been from roughly the 2000s until about 2017. The average tariff rate was around 1.5%, really low by historical standards, but it had been for a long time. President Trump in the first administration, largely through targeted actions on China, through established trade authorities, raised the average tariff rate from 1.5% to around 3%. And so you should think about tariffs like a retail sales tax. I mean, from an economic perspective, and most economists, virtually all economists agree on this. And so we went from 1.5% to 3%. And that isn't to say, that those weren't necessarily good ideas, because those were designed to extract concessions from China. If you had been in a cave through the first Trump administration and came out and just looked at the actual data as far as what happened with average tariff rates, you would say, oh, President Trump is probably a free trader. He renegotiated the USMCA and he kept tariff rates stable on every country except for China. Now, the average tariff went up, and that's what drove the average US tariff rate from around 1.5% to 3%. Biden largely kept the tariffs that were in place during the Trump administration. But here we are, and there's a lot of speculation. And so what has happened so far? So what happened so far was that President Trump announced new tariffs on China, so a plus up of 10 percentage points, 10% on Chinese tariffs, plus 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. He took out the de minimis exemption, which says if you have a shipment worth less than $800, it's not subject to tariffs. And then he announced higher tariffs on aluminum and then got rid of exemptions on steel. Now, if that's all that happens, there was a delay in the Canadian and Mexican tariffs. And so if all of that happens is we get this incrementally higher tariff on China, and then exemptions repealed for tariffs on steel, then a higher rate on aluminum, that's a pretty modest increase. But already we're now, because of the 10% increase on Chinese tariffs, we've gone from around 3% to around 4.5%. So that's a pretty, that's basically the same magnitude increase we saw in the first Trump administration. The significant part about what's happened so far, from my view, is not that the announced tariffs on Canada and Mexico, because those could possibly never come to fruition. What was really significant is that President Trump chose to use IEEPA as a vehicle for levying these tariffs. And so one of the big questions before the inauguration was, will Trump go the traditional route like he did in the first administration, where he uses established trade authorities, like you've maybe heard of Section 301 or 232. 232, for example, is used in the name of national security, and that's how he assessed tariffs on aluminum and steel. These types of trade authorities take a lot of time. So they weren't put in place until 2018. You have a body like the Department of Commerce, a U.S. trade representative, has to do an investigation, and there's opportunity for comments. And they're just, even though the president has authority, they're designed to be incremental and targeted. Using IEEPA, which allows the president basically to declare.
So let's be sure everybody on the call knows when you say IEEPA, what is that?
So I am forgetting what it stands for. IEEPA was a law that was put in place in the mid-70s, but basically allows the president to declare a trade emergency and levy whatever tariffs he wants.
Okay.
And so there's now a legal question as far as whether or not IEEPA can be used in the way that President Trump has used it, but it has basically opened the door for him to go from using the existing trade authorities to using whatever he wants to do on tariffs. And it just changes the aperture for the magnitude of the tariffs that we could see. You could use IEEPA for an across-the-board tariff. You could use IEEPA for targeted tariffs on all imports from certain countries. It really just kind of raises the likelihood we'll see sweeping tariffs. So as far as you asked, what do I expect? My expectation is that we will see higher rates of tariffs on China, because that's a politically safe place to go. I mean, I had breakfast with a bunch of senators and members of Congress a couple of weeks ago and was surprised. I mean, I expected some anti-China sentiment, but I mean, you would think that we're at war with China based on how some of these members are speaking. And so I think that from a political perspective, President Trump ran on an agenda of raising tariff rates, particularly on China. So he's protected there. And then also from other members of Congress, I think are very comfortable with him going higher. Not that he'll ask Congress's permission, he'll use the IEEPA authority. But I could expect a similar 10 percentage point increase in Chinese tariffs. My guess is you'll see some sort of tariff on auto imports, and the steel and aluminum have already been painful for those industries. But I think you could see higher tariffs on imports. I'm kind of skeptical you'll see imports on, you'll see tariffs on China, on Canada and Mexico, the 25% tariffs that were threatened, in large part because virtually every bank that models this says this could be recessionary. So just to kind of give you some numbers from Ernst & Young, which are similar to those you'll see, from other financial entities. I mean, if you saw an increase, these 25% tariffs just on Mexico and Canada come into play, they found that GDP would fall by 1.5 percentage points in 2025. I mean, if we're only growing at 2.5%, that pushes us close to zero. 2.1% fall in 2026. I mean, we're really getting in recession territory. Inflation rises by 70 basis points in 2025 and by about 40 basis points in 2026. So inflation becomes a bigger problem. The Fed is obviously watching tariffs. So, it really could be recessionary.
Weren't those posed because Trump wanted, or the administration wanted, Mexico to do something about immigration and fentanyl, and Canada to do something about immigration and fentanyl, and both of them to work better with us? And they've both at least according to the newspapers, taken steps in that direction.
Yeah, I
What
mean,
do
I
you-
think there's a lot of skepticism, particularly around, first of all, almost no fentanyl comes in through Canada.
Canada,
A lot
right?
comes in through Mexico that originated in China. The Mexican authorities already had 15,000 troops at the border, so saying we'll commit to 10,000 was no concession at all. But yeah, I mean, that's how it was sort of posed. And I think that one thing the Trump administration does very well is send up these policy test balloons.
Yeah,
You know, kind of sort of suggested things, see how it's perceived before moving forward. All administrations do this in their various ways, but the Trump administration is really good at it. And so, you know, I think that they saw the financial sector didn't really like these tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And my guess is that when we get to March 4th, you'll see them extended again.
I hope that's the case. Um, if that's the case and it moves forward along the lines that you talked about before in terms of China and so forth, um, overall impact on the economy, I think what I heard you say or what I understood was not that great. Obviously not moving the right direction, but not that great.
Yeah, so now we're around, the average tariff rate is around 5%,
Hmm.
a little under, with really high rates on China. And if we go higher just on China in an incremental way, like like not the 60% tariff that the president was talking about, but you know, at 10%. And if those tariffs are used to extract concessions from China, which in many ways is a terrible trading partner,
Mm.
um, you know, that could be a good outcome for the United States. So my general rule of thumb for Trump tariffs are the more targeted, the better. And if we're able to extract concessions, now the real threat comes if there's an across the board tariff and then you see retaliatory tariffs. And look, I mean, I would not want to be a US soybean farmer right now.
Yeah,
Things
right.
look really bad for certain exporters. It's going to be a tough time for the auto industry. And this retaliation is really painful for domestic exporters. So the key is being targeted and extracting concessions for US companies.
Yeah. In terms of US employment, that could take the same kind of hit as prices, I would assume, if all goes negatively with a broad swath of tariffs. Again, if they're focused and in particular industries, maybe not such an aggregate impact, but difficult for different industries, as I would think.
Yeah, I mean, if we're seeing a hit to GDP, okay, let's say we're growing at 2.5% next year, absent a strong tariff reform agenda, and we see all these tariffs hit, and then growth slows to 0.5 percentage point. So not a recession, but within spitting distance of one.
Yeah.
I mean, you could expect the unemployment rate to go from 4% to 5% or even higher. Just because everything's so interrelated, and as exporters start laying off people, you get less consumption and so on
Yeah.
and so forth.
I mean, the other promise to consumers uh, related to economic policy has to do with taking taxes down and making a tax cut. Republicans are all in favor of that in terms of fiscal policy, but the bigger our debt gets, it has other implications as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so fiscal policy, I mean, the most interesting thing happening in Washington right now is around Doge. The second most interesting
Yep.
thing is around trade
Right.
policy. And the third most interesting thing that will probably dominate the second half of this year is around fiscal policy. And so there are two big questions on fiscal policy, which is to say, one, will Republicans in Congress have one reconciliation bill or two? And then the second really interesting question is, regardless, what will happen on taxes? And so just for some quick background, so everyone on the call is on the same page, when an administration has less than 60 votes in the Senate, and they want to do anything on the budget, they're probably going to have to go through a reconciliation package. The way a reconciliation process works is that first a budget resolution is passed, and then instructions are given out to the various committees And then as long as the committees report legislation which is consistent with those instructions, it can pass through the Senate with 50 votes. Now, it can't be related to Social Security. And after 10 years, it has to be revenue neutral. So literally you'll see in the budget resolution, like one line that says, to the Finance Committee, report legislation that does not increase the deficit by more than $1.5 trillion, which was the instructions given in 2017, which enabled the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so once the budget committees write that resolution and basically provide a blank check, that's how big the spending will be. That's how big the TCJA was, and Democrats do the same thing. So one big question is whether or not Republicans in Congress will do 2 reconciliation bills or 1. If they do 2 reconciliation bills, you'll see around $200 or $300 billion for border security and possibly a bunch of pay-fors, because I think that they would not want that bill, which is relatively small, to be deficit enhancing. But the real question is then what happens with the tax cuts? And so the cost of extending the TCJA, which was the legislation that was put in place in 2017, that was both permanent and temporary. So the permanent part about that was taking the corporate tax rate from 35% down to 21%. And that was paid for through changing our system of international taxation and also changing the inflation parameters in the tax code. So that's permanent, that's locked in, that's not on the table. If nothing happens, the corporate tax rate will stay at 21%. So the real question is mostly around the individual side. Will you see an extension of those tax cuts? And the 10-year cost of that is around $4.5 trillion.
Yep.
Now, so one iteration is where and this has been discussed, where the cost of extending that tax cut is just assumed in the baseline, where basically members of Congress would change the scoring rules so that they don't have to account for that in the budget resolution.
That's interesting.
It is interesting and is, I think, really bad news for our public debt.
Yeah.
I don't know if that will happen or not. My assumption had been that that would not happen, that $4.5 trillion was too expensive a price tag. So you might see a 4, 5, or 6-year extension in the TCJA that might cost $2 trillion. They're going to have to do something on the SALT deduction. That could cost another 300 to 500 billion. President Trump had promised relief for taxes on wages and overtime. That could run
And
you
tips and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, he can't, because nothing on Social Security can go through reconciliation. He can't give tax breaks on Social Security, which I think would have been a bad idea anyway. It would have accelerated the exhaustion of the Medicare Trust Fund by 5 years. But he gave a lot of promises around targeted tax relief. And so my guess is you're going to want to do something on that. So that's another $500 billion to $1 trillion. It's, all in, it's a cost of $1 trillion over 10 years. And so you're going to have some pay-fors, because there's no way the Freedom Caucus is going to go for that much extra. So you can expect spending cuts on non-defense discretionary, possibly some sort of caps that are put in place. But you can also expect spending cuts on Medicaid, which has been a priority for Republican policymakers for a long time. You can expect certain parts of the IRA to get rolled back, but it's tough to do too much because so much of that benefits Republican districts. So, for example, the tax break for electric vehicles, I think, was almost certainly going to get rolled back. If they need money, they can go ahead and cut some of the out-year subsidies for energy production. That might raise $300, $400, $500 billion at the extreme. But it's hard to get these pay-fors. So Republican...
You roll it all up into a package. Who's going to benefit and who's going to not benefit from what it looks like will be done with the cuts in spending versus taxes?
Yeah, if you're relying on Medicaid, you're probably not paying a lot in income taxes, if anything.
Right.
And so, that's going to be the population that's going to get hurt. And those at the top will do better. One priority has been repealing the estate tax. That costs $370 billion over 10 years. But there you're already talking about the richest, 1 in 1,000 families. There's already an exemption for $20 million or so. So it would be regressive. And, tariffs are regressive too. They're taxes on consumption. They're like retail sales taxes that cities and states have. So there is this question as far as, a lot of the people that voted for President Trump, may feel like they're worse off. Um, and that will be another constraining factor as well. So my expectation around this is that you're probably going to see around $3 or $4 trillion in extra borrowing, that you're going to see a less than 10-year extension of the TCJA. You're going to see something on SALT, but it'll be pretty small because it's so expensive. And that the pay-fors will come in the form of some tariff revenue will be assumed, but nothing like the max 1.9 trillion that it could potentially go up to. Be more like, I don't know, $500 billion. And at the end of the day, there'll be some talking points in a way between dynamic scoring, which is just to say, claims around better economic output. And there'll be a way for it to be packaged.
Oh, make it look better, whether
Make it
is better.
look better. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But interesting who potentially suffers and who potentially gains. It's sort of different than the people who even, who voted Trump into power, thinking that they were the people who were going to benefit.
Yeah,
It's
and I
interesting.
generally, we're getting outside of economics a little bit, but
Yes, that's
I
true.
don't.
And we shouldn't. I agree with you. We shouldn't.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's lots of distributional tables,
Yeah,
and some people benefit from this package and some people lose. And the bottom 40-50% tend to be pretty strong losers.
yeah. Turning to another risky topic, that's immigration. We're only a few weeks into the new Congress and the administration and all. There's been a lot of thinking, I'm sure, on at least the Mexican border. What are your thoughts about immigration and the potential for curtailing it and or sending people back, and the implication for higher wages in the US economy?
So I will say just from the outset that I think that one mistake of the Biden administration was not being more aggressive on enforcement at the border at the beginning.
Yeah.
And these, the problem here wasn't necessarily people sort of sneaking across the border so much. It was people seeking asylum and having a system. You're allowed to seek asylum, it's perfectly legal, but we didn't really have a system in place, particularly during COVID, for adjudicating all of those cases. And then people sit in the United States while they're waiting for them to be adjudicated. Now, the Biden administration ultimately ended up shutting down the border if those cases became too much for the system, which I thought was a really good adjustment. It probably should have been done earlier. But we heard for a while about the goal of deporting 10 million people. And there have been pretty big deportation campaigns in the past, including by Democratic presidents. So, I'm going to try to keep this in the economic realm. I think to a certain extent, when we had that really tight labor market in 2022, the labor market was saved by this big increase in immigration. And,
Yeah.
we saw a lot more people coming in than we expected, around 100,000 more a month, which is good news if you're a consumer. It's bad news probably if you're a construction worker in Scottsdale. And so immigration, like everything else, has trade-offs. But just to say, we had a really tight labor market that was probably saved to a certain extent by increased immigration. And so, I would hear this goal of 10 million people getting deported and think like, there's no way that you'd have 10 million people getting deported without changing systems of enforcement that are really uncomfortable to Americans. So schools have traditionally been off limits, right? Like having ICE
Churches.
officials, churches,
Yeah.
and sometimes places of business have also been off limits. We've been uncomfortable with things like checkpoints along highways where you have to show your citizenship status. And so I thought there's no way we're going to get to 10 million people deported. I think that's still true, but in part because of research at Brookings by Tara Watson and Wendy Ellerberg, really outstanding research, we can get to negative outmigration pretty quickly. And the way you get there is by better border enforcement, by changing the status of people who are here legally to being illegal. So, for example, by removing temporary protected status from people from, who are seeking asylum from Venezuela and other countries. By a general cooling effect, so the rhetoric, this kind of like anti-immigration rhetoric, and then by relatively low numbers of deportations, and also by changing visa programs and the like. So we can actually get to negative migration. So we have actually out migration, which is something I think we've probably never seen, at least in the last half century. With a labor market that's tight, that's maybe not the worst thing in the world. But with a labor market, where you've got, that isn't in the best shape, I think there's real concern. Sorry, I said it the opposite way. With the tight
Yeah,
labor
I was going to
market,
say, I think,
sorry, I got that mixed up. With a labor market that's tight, that's really problematic with
yeah,
having so many people out migration. It gets that much tighter. And so I do worry more about this wage price spiral. People start to anticipate higher prices, in part because, as we talked about earlier, people are used to used to inflation. But also, we didn't see in the last inflation episode, we did not see wage-driven inflation very much, right? So inflation was driven by the price of products going higher and higher. It wasn't driven by labor shortages so much and people, workers demanding higher and higher wages
higher
that
in
being
wages,
passed
yeah.
on to consumers. I think in certain markets that could happen if we see negative outmigration. We see a shrinking labor force, particularly with the aging of the U.S. population.
Yeah, that seems baked in a cake. I think that takes us to this concept of deregulation and what deregulation does in terms of perhaps making the economy more flexible on the one hand, but on the other hand, what's the cost of it and who bears that cost? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think that there are, look, the business community clearly did not like the Biden administration's regulatory agenda. Lena
Right.
Khan and Gary Gensler are not popular in the business community.
You
Gary,
say,
what's that?
it's amazing you say that. I mean, there was so many different articles about that. Yeah.
And so I think that there is a lot of excitement around lessened regulation in the business community, but it's not very defined. And when I first came to Brookings, I went and testified to Congress on deregulation, and I went in expecting a lot of targeted questions around deregulation of the financial sector, deregulation in labor markets, deregulation on climate. Most of the questions were related to really these aggregate measures of regulatory burden, like the number
Yeah.
of pages of regulation or the number of hours spent complying or the overall aggregate cost. And that is just to say that policymakers, I think, have not really figured out what they mean by deregulation. Trump had this 2-for-1 swap where for every new piece of regulation that you would propose, you had to get rid of 2. That's not really how regulation is made. It's made in a more thoughtful, balanced way where you weigh the costs and benefits. And so I don't think it's very well defined at this point. And I think it's probably more of a 2026 and 2027 question than a 2025 question.
Yeah.
But it has, I guess the benefit has been this boost in animal spirits around
Yeah.
deregulation and this hope that
Yeah, market animal spirits, in businesses as they see potentially their costs, their over the cost that they're stuck with in terms of regulation going down.
yeah.
The thing that would worry me is the impact on people. That less regulation, less support for people, less, medical costs, but this and that comes out of a regulatory environment that when it's cut away, people don't benefit from that.
Yeah, and there's
Goes
also
all in the direction of the people running the businesses.
yeah, and in the last Trump administration, the regulatory posture was made before this Supreme Court case known as the end of Chevron deference.
Yeah,
And lawyers that we've had write on this can articulate it much better than I can. But in general, there is less deference given to the agencies in terms of both creating new regulation and rolling back old ones. And so, I don't know what the adherence to rule of law will look like moving forward, but if it's preserved, That is to say, the ability of agencies in the Trump administration, because of that Supreme Court decision,
Mhm.
to roll back prior regulatory actions is going to be severely diminished.
Yep.
So the Trump administration's hands are tied a little bit because of that decision.
If it chooses to believe its hands are tied,
Yes.
which seems to be, really trying to think about the things that it wants to do independent of the restrictions that have been always there, and then testing how big those restrictions are.
Yeah, I mean the last administration, the last Trump administration, Trump certainly pushed the limits, but ultimately respected court decisions.
Yep.
It's been much more aggressive this time around. Judges have been fired. It's been much more aggressive in the first month as far as pushing the limits of the law. And my real concern is that we sort of walk away from being a country that largely adheres to the rule of law.
Yeah.
And we didn't talk about Doge and the like, but I think that's what's getting people's blood pressure up. Look, I can even handle it across the board 10% tariff, and I can handle growth going from 2.5% down to 1%. And I can handle paying more for lots of products. What's hard for me to stomach is if we're no longer a country that respects the rule of law.
Yeah. We're going to take some questions in just a minute or so, but I want to go back to the beginning after this discussion of risks and possibilities and tariffs and all of that. A year from now, what's your best guess of where we'll be?
So I happen to think that particularly when it comes to policymakers, the best guide to the future is the past. And we have 4 years of past policymaking to rely on. My guess is that you'll see on the immigration, okay, we'll start with just going down the line. So on immigration, I think you'll see a $300 billion border security bill. I think you'll see marginal changes to internal enforcement and to visa programs. And I think you'll see very limited immigration to the US, but it'll still be positive. On tariffs, I think you'll see a 10% increase in roughly, let's say 5 to 15% increase in the tariff rate on Chinese imports. I think you'll see targeted high profile tariffs, including additional tariffs on autos and not a lot else. Trump has some really smart economic advisors around him, which I think will caution him against going too strong here. I think on a fiscal policy package, you'll see 2 bills. I think that you'll see one happen in the next 2 to 3 months around border security. You'll see a second happen around the holidays when Congress feels like it needs to make a deal. I don't know how it's going to deal with the debt limit, which should be hitting sometime in the summer.
Yeah.
But I think that bill, I mean, there are a lot of questions around it. I think in general, you'll see roughly a 5-year extension of the TCJA, and coupled with a few targeted additional tax cuts, you'll see some rollback in Medicaid spending, and that they'll use additional revenues from tariffs and some dynamic scoring to get to a claim of revenue neutrality.
Okay. So we won't fall off a cliff, but it's going to be difficult.
I mean, I think that consumption will remain strong. There's a lot of wealth propelling us forward. 4% unemployment. People are still relying on their wages, and so you've got a very adept head of the Treasury in Scott Bessent. You've got Kevin Hassett, who's a talented economist running NEC. And if we see a crisis, I think that they're going to handle it. You also have, I think, a terrific Federal Reserve, which is we're very fortunate to have Jay Powell. It's my view.
Yep.
And if there's a financial or fiscal crisis, they'll handle it also.
Terrific. Questions?
All right,
Ellen?
Kathy, let me give you 3.
Okay.
So, one is, how do you expect the change in tariffs to change trade patterns? That's question 1. Question 2 is,
We could write a book on that one.
I know. Well, 2 is, what is the expected impact of the more positive regulatory environment and how these changes may impact growth and inflation? So it's continuing the conversation on the regulatory. And the 3rd relates to stock performance, the performance of the Magnificent Seven in stock valuations Is growth going to continue to have the high valuations moving forward? What is the expectation? What are the expectations for growth in the capital markets? So question one is,
We got them.
you got them. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so trade patterns, the reason a lot of these tariffs were put in place was to try to promote domestic production. And I think in some cases you will see production get shifted back to the United States. Now it's often more expensive and consumers will pay, but that's good news if you're an employer or employee in those industries. So you will see, I think, a shift in some cases back to domestic production, but now we're only seeing tariffs on China. And I think that moving forward, it's been pretty clear the Trump administration is wary of higher tariffs on consumer goods. So, for example, they put tariffs on washing machines in the first administration, and that there were all of these reports about washing machines being like $100 more expensive. So it's, I think, politically safer to put tariffs on intermediate goods rather than final goods for consumers. So that's what, you'll probably see a shift back to production either in the United States or in countries with whom we have free trade agreements and their low tariff rates relative to China. On the question around deregulation, I mean, it's tough. Deregulation is really a microeconomic issue because each regulation impacts a very particular area differently. But cumulatively, they have these macroeconomic impacts. My guess is that right now, the deregulatory environment is propelling investment forward. And so investment's really strong in the United States. Residential investment is not strong.
Business fixed investment.
Yeah, business fixed investment is very strong right now. Part of that was driven by the IRA. I mean, we had $1 trillion in tax incentives for the production of clean energy, and that drove a lot of investment, particularly in red states. But there's also this anticipation of a better regulatory environment for businesses, I think, driving investment forward. I think that's really what you'll see from a macro standpoint, most of the action. The third question, sorry, was on.
Third question was on capital markets. It had to do with the valuations,
Magnificent
stock valuations.
Oh, yeah. And so, I mean, part of it is who knows, but I guess it's a really good question. My sense is that anticipation of an AI-driven productivity shock has pushed the valuation of the Mag 7 up really high. And I think that's look, I don't know. I'm coming out with a paper this week about the impact of AI on the federal deficit, and we can talk about that later. But I'm not an AI optimist necessarily. I think my best guess, and there's so much uncertainty. No one knows what's going to happen with AI. My sense is that AI will have real implications for very targeted tasks, but will probably not have a huge impact on economy-wide productivity. So, for example, radiology, AI already has revolutionized radiology.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be a radiologist in 15 years. It's already more accurate.
Well, there won't be radiologists as we know them in 15 years.
They won't be radiologists as we know them.
Yeah.
It's already more accurate if I'm worried about having oral cancer to take a picture of my mouth and have it read by AI than it is by having a radiologist. And there's certain other tasks and maybe a handful of professions I think that will be made obsolete by AI. I think you will get a productivity boost, but it's not going to be. If I had to guess, if you gave me sort of the over/under, compared it to the late 90s productivity boost because of the internet, I would take the under. And so my guess is that the Mag 7, a lot of the increase in valuation has been built up around AI optimism, and I'm already starting to see that starting to wane. But who knows? I mean, I could be very, very wrong on this. That's my best guess.
More questions, Ellen?
Ellen, you're muted.
Sorry, thought I came off. Housing and housing inflation. How do how do you see it? There was a reference to the fact that California is considering relaxing construction rules to rebuild after the wildfires. Is this needed nationwide, or is it all about cost, labor? And where do you see that going? One. And two, what are your expectations for the trade weighted value of the US dollar? Any chance that countries will trade using another currency?
Uh,
Always a standard question, right?
Yeah, really great question. So I will say, I think that lack of affordable housing is probably our greatest economic problem facing the United States and has been for a long time.
Yep.
And the reason why we haven't seen an increase in housing supply is because people really like living in the current zoning laws that exist. And it is really hard to change that. Look, I put enormous resources into buying. I'm married, my wife and I have 3 daughters. It was really important to me to have a big house to raise them in with a yard. I live on a dead end street with other houses that have yards. I really don't want to live across the street from a 6-unit, 8-unit building. And I think that a lot of other people feel the same way. There's a reason why it's so hard to change zoning laws, is because once you've purchased a home in an area with certain zoning laws, you really like those zoning laws. And I will say this is up for debate. I mean, there is some survey evidence that suggests I'm wrong about this, but that's my gut instinct. But what is not up for debate is that we've had a very hard time changing zoning laws in this country at the local level. So one of the major proposals out of Kamala Harris was to create this $50 billion innovation fund that was used as incentives for localities to go ahead and change their zoning. Now, there have been certain things that are more popular, that are usually on the margin. Oregon's had some success. California's had a little bit of success. There's this legislator in California named Scott Wiener that's managed to push some things through. But in general, I think that changing zoning laws are really unpopular. We thought that when we had these higher interest rates and you saw average rates on 30-year fixed go around 7%, that might go ahead and help rebalance the housing market. But the problem was those were put in place after decades of ultra low rates on mortgages. And so people had refinanced into these really low rates.
Yeah.
And so you got this lock-in effect. Look, I think the Fed should get housing out of its preferred rate of inflation. That's my own personal view. It was really problematic the last go round. So anyway, on housing, I don't see any real solution in sight unless you're able to change local zoning laws, and that's just been really hard. The second, sorry, Ellen, I should start writing down these questions. What was the second part of that question? Oh, on the value of the dollar. So on the value of the dollar, I pretty much just listened to my colleague Robin Brooks, who's this terrific. He used to run FX strategy for Goldman Sachs. He's a Brookings scholar. He's in our global development program here. His view is that even though you saw a run up in the dollar post election, that there's still room to run, and that we really haven't internalized the impact of higher tariffs yet. And he thinks you could see a pretty substantial run up in the dollar. You saw a big run up in the 10-year on treasuries. You saw about 100 bips run up right around the time the markets decided there's a high chance, not just of President Trump winning the election, but also of having unified control. And so the average rate on treasuries went from a little over 3.5% to a little over 4.5% over a very short period of time. Pretty remarkable run up. Now it's subsided a little bit, but not very much since then. You did see a run up in the value of the dollar, but it hasn't been as stark. I think that's probably a mistake. My guess is you'll see the dollar continue to strengthen with this tariff policy and $3, $4, $5 trillion in new borrowing, which will make treasuries that much more, that bigger supply of treasuries hit the market.
More questions, Ellen?
Sure. There are a couple of interesting ones. One in particular, China has been moving supply to Mexico to near shore for the US. If tariffs are placed on China and Mexico, so let's just say they're on China and the Mexico's still on pause. How is that really going to help anything? And do you think there's going to be anything directed keeping sort of focusing, if you will, on China specific, even if they're making it in Mexico. So that's kind of an interesting question. That's one. Two, can you talk more about reciprocal tariffs?
Yes.
And is there a disconnect between stock market and the economy?
Yeah, let's take the second one first. That's
Okay,
fascinating.
reciprocal tariffs.
Okay,
Yeah.
reciprocal tariffs. So President Trump over the last week has noted that he wanted to go ahead and institute reciprocal tariffs. This was a theme that was popular in the first time he ran in 2016. Reciprocal tariffs can mean different things. Reciprocal tariffs, basically, there's three different ways to think about reciprocal tariffs. One is on a product by product basis, where if, I don't know, India places a tariff on US almonds, that we place a reciprocal tariff on almond imports from India. I don't know if India produces almonds, but so on a product by product basis. A second is a way to look at it is on a country specific level. So if the average tariff from country X is 5%, then we put a 5% tariff in general on imports from that country. And the third is around interpreting the definition of tariff more broadly to include other barriers to trade. The first two are a bit problematic. Look, I'm an economist. I generally don't like tariffs, particularly when they're not for a specific reason. So I characterize them as problematic. I think some of the tariffs the Trump administration did against China, the 301 and the like, were solid, but across the board tariffs are not. And so, but those would probably only raise the average value of tariffs by a few percentage points, because most countries don't have really high tariffs or on US, and we're still a fairly free trade world in general. So that would be modestly problematic. The area where you get into a real problem is if we start defining incorrectly value-added taxes, or VATs, as a barrier to trade.
Mm.
And so in the Obama administration, I was Biden's chief economist when he was vice president. The 2016 election was a surprise to me, like everyone else. And so I came out and started working for a hedge fund, which I really enjoyed. And one of my jobs working for the hedge fund was trying to predict what President Trump would do and try to interpret some of his economic policy signals. And it became clear to me that the president didn't really, either he didn't understand or didn't want to recognize the difference between a tariff and a value-added tax and a border adjustment tax. And these are really big differences between these. It's important to understand them. A value-added tax is trade neutral, right? If you're a US company producing in Germany, you're going to face the same rate as a German company producing in Germany, the same rate as a Chinese company producing in Germany. And if you export, then you get a rebate at the border. It's trade neutral. A VAT is trade neutral. President Trump has come out and said they're looking at value-added taxes as akin to a tariff. This is factually wrong, and that's really not up for debate. Value-added taxes are trade neutral. But if you're going to try to equate tariffs to value-added taxes, virtually every country in the world has a value-added tax other than the United States. Like Micronesia, I think maybe a handful of countries in the Middle East, but most countries have value-added taxes. And if we're going to levy tariffs at the same rate as those value-added taxes, I mean, that is a recipe for recession. I don't think they're going to do that. And they're not going to do that because they understand how problematic it would be. So if you see reciprocal tariffs and it's on a country by country basis, or if maybe just targeted at the handful of countries that have really large trade deficits with the United States, I would classify that as being modestly problematic.
Some of these things are so complicated and their implications are so complicated. Makes me wonder whether it's easy to talk about it from 50,000 feet, but really hard to do anything down in the 5,000-foot level about really changing a particular policy or a particular law or implementing something that's possible, but only in the extreme. You kind of wonder whether we're just going to end up in the middle somewhere, as opposed to some of the more drastic things that get thrown around.
Look, I mean, the best example about this that's on my mind right now is with the Doge cuts,
Yeah,
which I it's my view that they're largely illegal, and I think the courts will find them to be. But it sounds easy to say there's government waste and bloat, which there is. But when you have 2 million workers, it is really hard to say every single one of them is going to be productive and worthwhile. Of course, there's waste. There's government waste. I mean, I've had 4 stints in the public sector. I've seen it firsthand. But going through Treasury payment system and using that to try and cut results in really ill-advised cuts. And you've seen FAA staff get cut, and the high-profile cuts to people who oversee our nation's nuclear security. Those cuts were problematic. So, look, I'm all for auditing the federal government, but it should be in ways which are thoughtful and allow auditors to weigh the pros and cons. And we have the Government Accountability Office. And we do have an auditor in place that's been doing its job for quite some time now. So I think you're right, Kathy. It's very easy to talk about these things. And sometimes these broad sweeping statements are true, but broad sweeping statements don't always demand broad sweeping reforms. It really takes a scalpel in many cases.
we have kind of come to the final few minutes of this discussion, fireside chat, as they say. And I can't thank you enough, Ben, for the time you spent and sharing with us the incredible amount of detailed knowledge and thinking that you've put into your variety of different experiences and now at Brookings. So I'm wondering whether you could give us like 2 or 3 takeaways that you hope everyone will have learned from this discussion, and they can think about as they go back to whatever they're doing for the rest of the day.
So I guess I'll say, all right, 3 takeaways. The first is that as long as tariffs are targeted, either at specific products or even a specific country, as long as there's an opportunity to remove those tariffs if some concession is made, it's probably going to be not especially problematic and maybe even beneficial to the US economy. The second takeaway is that lots more debt is coming. And the question to ask yourself, not just as a business leader, but as an American, is whether or not that extra debt is worth it. But I would be shocked if we don't see independent scores of the policies undertaken by Congress this year to exceed $3 trillion.
Yeah.
And it could be as high as 5 or 6. That's just a ton of money, particularly when we're not in the middle of a recession. And the third takeaway is that, as an economist, and as an economist that's been affiliated with the Democratic Party, or has at least worked for the Democratic Party at least 4 different instances at very senior levels, I am much more worried about legal challenges than I am about anything that's going to happen in the US economy. And so if you told me that in 4 years, Liz Cheney doesn't go to jail, Congress still gets to make budget decisions, and court decisions are still respected, my blood pressure is going to go down a lot. I just don't want to see us look like a country like Hungary or Turkey or something where we just have dismissed the rule of law. I worry more about that than anything on the economic side.
Got a lot of people in your camp on that one, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate
this has been absolutely fantastic. Let me turn this back to Ellen.
All right, thank you, Ben and Kathy. That was an amazing conversation. I have a few quick announcements before you go on your way. Our program calendar is scheduled through September, and we hope you'll join us at one or more of our upcoming events. Our next event is on March 4th from 8 to 9:30 a.m. Eastern. It is a virtual program, Governance of Not-for-Profits in a Changing World. Save the dates for our day-long programs this year. We have 2. One is our Aspiring Public Company Director Program. It's an all-day program that will take place on April 16th. And on June 10th, we have an all-day program for sitting public company directors called Advanced Topics for Experienced Public Company Directors Program. And they are both all-day programs, and with the experienced public company director programs, the only people in the room will be sitting public company directors, and they're both days are just incredible. Finally, don't forget the survey. And by the way, we have people coming to the all-day sessions from across the US. Don't forget the survey. The link is in the chat. There's a QR code, I think, coming up on our screen, and it will be in our follow-up email, which you will all receive later today. Please take the time to fill it out now. We really do value your input, and we do use your comments to shape our programs going forward. Again, thank you to everyone for attending today. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a really wonderful day. Stay warm if you're in cold.
New England, yeah, right.
Well, also the Midwest.
Oh, yes, that's true too.
Thank you, Ellen.